There are bad arguments being made on the side of those who are against marijuana legalization, as well as bad arguments that are being made on the side of people who are for marijuana legalization. The question Americans should be asking themselves as they consider whether President Trump should make this change to the scheduling of marijuana is whether it would be better or worse for America to have more and cheaper marijuana. And I think that question answers itself. I'll start with a bad argument on the side of people who are right, but maybe right for the wrong reasons. Even as President Trump begins the federal takeover of law enforcement in Washington, D.C., the president is also contemplating a move that would actually be rather soft on crime. The Wall Street Journal has recently reported that President Trump is considering rescheduling marijuana from a Schedule I drug to a Schedule III drug. Now, that would be a change in the federal designation of marijuana that would make it basically easier to sell and more profitable as well. It would mean that tax breaks would become available for companies that sell cannabis products and marijuana. It would also mean that there would be potential revenue streams available for research and other kinds of development of this new Schedule III drug, as marijuana would be at that point. It's a very bad idea, and President Trump is considering it according to various sources because he likes 80-20 issues, and supposedly this is an issue, marijuana legalization or decriminalization, that commands about 80% support among the American public. The drug war appears to be lost and over, even though the Trump administration is making certain other changes to policy, including giving the U.S. military a green light to use force against Mexican cartels and drug cartels in other countries. Despite that, which is an escalation in the drug war, in other respects, it seems more like the drug war is heading towards a capitulation and a surrender on the part not only of America as a whole and as a federal government, but on the part of ordinary Americans who do not want to be assailed by marijuana smoke on the streets of our cities every day of the week. Hello, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, a conservative review. Modern Age is a quarterly print magazine, and it also has a website, modernagejournal.com. It's published by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and it is a publication that focuses on the intellectual and philosophical side of conservatism. We've been around since the 1950s, and we try to show the continuity of great conservative thought throughout the decades, and in fact throughout the centuries and beyond. Now, there are bad arguments being made on the side of those who are against marijuana legalization, as well as bad arguments that are being made on the side of people who are for marijuana legalization. The truth of the issue is something that should not lead one to adopt bad arguments simply because they are advancing one's own side. On the contrary, the case against marijuana is very strong based on the experiences that we've already had with legalized and generally more widely available marijuana in America's cities over the past decade and more. So really, this goes back to 2012, when Colorado became the first state to officially make recreational marijuana available, legal. It also, that referendum in 2012 in Colorado went into effect in 2014, but it had disastrous consequences for Colorado already within the span of about 7 or 8 years. So in 2022, it was already the case that marijuana use in Colorado and in the few other states that at that point which had legalized marijuana, you had marijuana use increasing by about 24% in those states, relative to the states where marijuana remained illegal. So the effect of legalizing marijuana, predictably enough, is that you get much more marijuana use. Now, the question Americans should be asking themselves as they consider whether President Trump should make this change to the scheduling of marijuana is whether it would be better or worse for America to have more and cheaper marijuana. And I think that question answers itself. And again, look to the experience you've had in your own towns and cities over the course of the last several years as marijuana enforcement has faded away, even in places where marijuana remains illegal, and in many other places, whether it's cities like Washington, D.C. or New York, or whether it's states like Colorado, in many places you have had an official legalization of recreational marijuana. In fact, there are 24 states now where recreational marijuana is legal to some degree or another. Now, I said that there are bad arguments on both sides, and I want to walk through a couple of those because they are instructive in terms of how we should think about this problem of marijuana. I'll start with a bad argument on the side of people who are right, but maybe right for the wrong reasons. Among conservatives, and among conservatives who are part of the more populist, perhaps even government-friendly side of the new right, you see arguments claiming that prohibition of alcohol originally worked. And so when they look at the case of marijuana, they say, you know what? People are saying that prohibition never works. That's a case that libertarians make. It's a case that proponents of legalization of marijuana claim. And yet they're mistaken, according to the New Right. New Right activists say that, in fact, prohibition of alcohol worked in the 20th century. Now, this claim rests on the fact that, indeed, during the Prohibition era, you had a reduction in alcohol consumption of between 30 and 50% in the United States. And then after Prohibition ended, there was an increase in alcohol consumption, but it never went back to the amount of consumption that had existed before Prohibition. So Prohibition did have an effect of reducing alcohol consumption, both when it was actually the law of the land, and then also afterwards when Prohibition had been repealed. Now, the problem with this argument, the problem with saying that Prohibition worked, is that, of course, Prohibition does not mean reduction. Prohibition means elimination. Prohibition means that there should be virtually no alcohol sales, at least, within the United States. There should be virtually no alcohol production. In fact, alcohol sales continued on the black market. Alcohol production continued on the black market. People had their whiskey stills. And because this was all happening on the black market, and this was all outside of legal channels, it meant that you had a criminal culture develop around illicit alcohol. This is, of course, the golden age of gangsterism in America. You have organizations, organized crime, taking root in order to supply alcohol, to sell it, to brew it, distill it, and make it available. This, of course, leads to the creation or the amplification of organizations like the FBI. It leads to changes in government. It leads to the growth of government. And in fact, there is a very good case to be made, and it's made by people such as Albert J. Nock, that there was a precedent for the New Deal set by the degree of social manipulation that was undertaken by the federal government during Prohibition. So Prohibition, in a way, is a precursor to the New Deal and to the entire era of big government that we've lived with for the last 80-plus years. So Prohibition was not, in fact, successful in prohibiting or eliminating the consumption of alcohol, but it did create a reduction. And of course, the same argument that would say that Prohibition worked, which again is not quite true, would also apply to the repeal of Prohibition, because when Prohibition was repealed, alcohol consumption did not take off. It did not skyrocket to the point of creating a national crisis. It did increase, but it did not increase beyond all measure. So based on the experience that America had with alcohol prohibition, many libertarians, many progressives, and even some conservatives who have gone soft on the question of drug use are now saying that we should take the same attitude towards marijuana, that marijuana prohibition does not work, therefore you should have marijuana legalization. They claim that the effect of marijuana prohibition has been to create much more crime. It creates a revenue stream. It creates a market opportunity for black marketeers and drug cartels, and for that matter, the street corner drug salesperson who is perhaps affiliated with a gang. And it's generally a very corrupting influence on not only our cities, but also within law enforcement itself. They say that trying to enforce laws against marijuana overburdens the justice system. It overburdens the courts. Most marijuana cases are pleaded down. They're not really cases that will send people to jail. But to the extent that there are, in fact, marijuana distribution, prosecutions that do lead people to jail, the opponents of marijuana prohibition say, well, you know what, that's unnecessary. That's, creating a burden in our jails, just as it's creating a burden on our courts, and just as it's creating, maybe distracting law enforcement from more serious crimes that they should be prosecuting. But really, the case against marijuana prohibition relies very heavily on this idea that organized crime is benefited by the drug being outlawed. And in fact, the argument that libertarians make is often a very sweeping one that applies to all illegal drugs. And they say, you know what, if you want to stop the cartels, if you want to stop the gangs, if you want to stop organized crime from profiting off of illegal drugs, the only way to prevent that is to legalize the drugs. Now, that's an even worse argument than the people on the other side have when they claim that prohibition worked. Because if you say that organized crime is the reason to get rid of laws against marijuana, if you claim that the best way to make sure that there's less violence associated with drug use is to make drugs legal, that argument would apply to any kind of criminal enterprise that involves a profit motive. So yes, you could say that muggings, for example, would be less violent. You could say carjackings would be less violent. You could say there would not be organized crime involved in chop shops if you simply legalized mugging, if you simply legalized car theft. If you legalized any crime, you necessarily perhaps will reduce the amount of violence involved in the commission of that crime, because of course at that point it's not a crime. At that point the victim is simply encouraged to surrender without a protest. Now, nobody would accept that kind of argument with respect to any other kind of crime other than these drug crimes. So nobody says that we're going to legalize grand theft auto because that will take organized crime's profit margins really down and prevent, some of the violence that's associated with carjacking. You still want to have a fundamental rule of law that says citizens who are law-abiding are not going to be assaulted. They're not going to be not only assaulted, but they're not going to have their property taken from them against their wishes by thugs. So regardless of whether or not there is a certain amount of violence that's created by enforcing the law against grand theft of automobiles, nevertheless, that violence is a price of upholding civilization. And so we see that police have to enforce the law there. And we see that, of course, you're going to have criminal gangs that will get involved in selling stolen cars and selling stolen auto parts precisely because there is a profit to be made. That profit might not exist if this was not on a black market, but that's not an argument to be made for allowing criminals simply to take cars without any resistance on the part of the public or the police. Well, how does this apply to marijuana? Marijuana is not, an example of theft. It's not the case that these drug users are going out and taking the belongings of ordinary citizens who are just trying to go about their lives. Libertarians actually argue that marijuana use is a victimless crime, if it's a crime at all. And they claim that this is something that people should be allowed to do privately. Maybe it's a vice. Libertarians don't necessarily have to insist that marijuana use is a good thing. But they'll say, you know what, if it's a bad thing, it's a private vice. It's not something that has a detrimental effect outside of the people who are using it. And unfortunately, there is a growing body of medical evidence which suggests that marijuana is very detrimental to people who use it, especially people who use it very heavily, that it contributes to psychosis and other mental problems, and that it arrests development and generally creates terrible mental health issues for young people who start using it. We also see that marijuana use is not only increasing overall, but it's also the marijuana that's being used is more potent than ever and is exacerbating these kinds of health problems. So the claim that marijuana is harmless is no longer really accepted even by people who want to promote the acceptance of marijuana and the legalization of marijuana. Instead, there's an increasing awareness that yes, it is harmful, but the argument you hear from many libertarians and progressives is that even if marijuana is harmful, it's less harmful than alcohol, which clearly can destroy your liver. Alcohol can lead to people behaving very badly in the streets and in their own homes. And so if we tolerate alcohol, if alcohol is something that's legal, therefore the proponents of marijuana legalization claim we must also make marijuana available because they say it may be harmful, but it's less harmful than alcohol. Now, the problem with this is that those of us, I live in the Washington, D.C. area. I think we have, viewers who are watching this from New York, from cities on the West Coast, in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and we have folks in smaller towns throughout the country, all of whom have had the experience of seeing and, in fact, smelling marijuana use in public. The claim that many libertarians and progressives were making, saying that marijuana use would be private, that it was something that would only affect the users themselves and not society as a whole, has been proven to be false over the course of the last several years as marijuana enforcement has decreased, as marijuana use has increased, and as legalization has gained momentum. In fact, our cities are now open-air drug dens in many cases. You can't walk the streets of New York or Washington, D.C., or in fact many of the suburbs of these cities without being assailed by marijuana. And it's not just the smell of marijuana, it's also seeing folks who are, outside using it and creating, a very bad example for anyone walking by, creating a sense of menace and a sense of instability and lawlessness within our cities. Now, I have seen with my own eyes a couple of examples of what happens when marijuana starts to intrude upon a urban environment. So a few years ago, the Washington, D.C. metro system, its subway system, was undergoing a renovation, and so the subway cars were replaced for a time by buses. The buses were shuttling people from Washington, D.C. to Reagan National Airport, and from Reagan National Airport to Point South in Virginia. Well, I was on one of these buses, or rather I was in line at Reagan National Airport to get on one of these buses. And the bus driver, a middle-aged African-American gentleman, comes out of the bus and starts yelling at a couple of teenagers who were in line. These teenagers were smoking marijuana. And the bus driver said, look, first of all, that isn't actually legal here in Virginia. It certainly isn't legal within the vicinity of Reagan National Airport. But he also said there are children in this line. How can you kids, how can you punks be doing this and basically corrupting these young children? Well, when I looked at that situation, when I heard this bus driver having to go out and personally enforce the law, personally enforce the standards of society, it occurred to me, what kind of person would I be if I were siding with these teenage punks over this bus driver who is, someone who is basically working class. He is the salt of the earth. He's the kind of person who, to the extent that a city like Washington, D.C. Works at all, it's because it has people like him who are doing their jobs, who are making an honest living, and who are trying to uphold basic standards of civilization, even when people are just standing in line for a bus. So it occurred to me, I should be supporting laws and politicians and policies that are going to reinforce this man's ability to keep civilization on its feet. And I should definitely be opposing the attitude of these teenagers, which is that it's fine to destroy the fabric of the community that's around you, even if you're in a bus line. Now, there was another example, another incident a few years later, which again brought home the same lesson. I was walking through a part of one of the suburbs of Washington, D.C., one of the Virginia suburbs, and this was around Thanksgiving, and there was a young mother who had a little girl with her, and she was holding her hand, and they were walking through a neighborhood, and the neighborhood absolutely reeked of marijuana. And it just occurred to me, why on earth do we tolerate this? Why do we let little girls of about 4 or 5 years old be exposed to these marijuana fumes, be exposed to basically a degenerate culture of, libertinism that's not only being, pursued in the privacy of one's home, but rather that is being flaunted in public and it is being broadcast to even underage persons? Why do we tolerate this? Shouldn't we, in fact, be able to enforce a law which says, no, if your marijuana smoke is going to be something that is going to affect children, but not just children, also any citizen who does not want to be exposed to those fumes and does not want to be exposed to that culture. If your use of the drug is going to have an effect on other people like this, then you can't use it, and you certainly cannot use it in public. And so there has to be public standards that are maintained. Now, obviously, the war against drugs has not been going very well over the course of many decades, particularly with respect to marijuana. A lot of college students, even many college conservatives, say, you know what, I've known people who used marijuana. They have not, their lives have not gone off the rails as a result of it. This is not necessarily a drug that's going to lead as a gateway into the use of harder drugs. It's not the case that most people who use marijuana turn into, deadbeats or people who are sort of dropouts from society. The pathologies that you find associated with marijuana are the pathologies of a relatively small minority, and it's even possibly the case that many folks who already have mental illnesses are drawn to marijuana rather than it being the case that marijuana is what triggers the mental illnesses. Although clearly there's a bit of a cycle there where people who may be on the borderline of mental illness can be driven over that border by their use of drugs. Nevertheless, even in college, even many conservatives have come to tolerate the use of marijuana among their peers. And it's understandable why that would be. So within college, especially the more demanding colleges where you actually have to study hard, and there still are a few of those left in America, it's the case that there is a certain amount of self-discipline that is being applied by college students. There's a certain amount even of self-discipline that was necessary in order to get into colleges in the first place. And so college students might be able to to keep their lives on track, even if they are indulging in destructive recreations like marijuana. But when you take that kind of drug, which has generally the effect of making people less disciplined, and you introduce it to society at large, particularly to our cities, you wind up with a culture that just increases the amount of disrespect, the amount of antisocial behavior throughout the public sphere. It's very similar, in fact, to the use of extremely loud music in public, which one finds is often now happening in our cities. Even in what used to be quieter suburbs, like Alexandria, Virginia, it's now the case that cars drive by with, the maximum volume music playing out of their out of their stereo systems. People are going around in public, not only with their cell phones, turned up and broadcasting whatever's on their phones to everyone that's around them, but for that matter, they're even going around with, amplified speakers and generally creating a cacophony throughout our cities and our suburbs, and in fact, our smaller towns too. All of this is closely tied in with the culture of disrespect and the culture of drug use that one finds quite pervasive within America today. And it's something that should be restricted. It's something that should be kept out of the public sphere. It may be the case that total prohibition of marijuana is not going to be feasible. Certainly, if President Trump is correct that this is an 80-20 issue in which 80% of Americans take a softer view of marijuana use, that's something where it's unlikely that you're going to see anything like a rigorous prohibition applied. But there should certainly be stronger laws preventing the use of marijuana within the public and preventing the exposure of people who do not want to interact with marijuana culture and with marijuana fumes from being forced to accept exposure to this very aggressive, stench and this very aggressive kind of bad culture. And certainly it's something that children should be, kept away from. It's remarkable. By the way, one of the things that's pushing for the legalization of marijuana, this is not just a spontaneous movement on the part of the public, even if the public has a rather lackadaisical attitude towards marijuana use. Instead, there is a billion-dollar cannabis industry, multi-billion-dollar cannabis industry that is aggressively lobbying for further liberalization of marijuana laws, further liberalization of cannabis use. And this marijuana lobby and the marijuana industry, it's a big business. It's big dope, really. And it is even creating, candy out of marijuana. So it's how can anyone be surprised that there are children who wind up actually being very ill because they consume, for example, what look like gummy bears or gummy candy that are in fact cannabis laced. This is something where, again, it's a culture of carelessness. There's a culture of not just indulgence, not just childishness, but, sort of heedlessness of consequences that one finds among cannabis users and among marijuana users. It really is a powerfully antisocial force, and it should be restricted. It has to be kept out of our cities. I very much hope that President Trump, in taking federal control of law enforcement in Washington, D.C., is going to make sure that there is less of this public culture of drug use, that we don't have Washington, D.C. become an open-air drug den. And it seems to me that before President Trump even considers changing the scheduling of marijuana, he should first insist that America's cities and localities and states have stronger laws on the books preventing the use of marijuana in public. Let's force those who have been advocating for the liberalization of marijuana laws, let's force them to live up to their guarantees. They had claimed at the very beginning of marijuana legalization that this would be something people would do recreationally in the privacy of their own homes and their own spaces, and this would not be something that would be a public menace and a public nuisance. Let's make them live up to that claim. If you are going to have marijuana legal at all, it should be very much restricted to use within people's own homes or use within very private spheres. It should not be something that members of the public are assaulted by.